Can you hear the, like, have you been next to it? Like, whoa? My name's Philip Ray Scott, and I like making large abstract sculpture, mainly in metal. When I was building my studio, I was finishing the gable ends and curving off the great roof on the side walls. I noticed that the corrugation lines, which start out sort of like this, by the bottom were just so sort of long and slender. This gave me the inspiration to try meeting 2 pieces of corrugation and then 3 and so on. Contrary to what you'd think, because they're hard-edged, geometric and straight, comes this amazing wobbly edge, almost by accident and kind of uncontrollably. And although this is a great, big, heavy looking thing, it's also got quite a nice, playful, soft sort of edge. Building my enormous studio, I felt enormously constrained and contained, and this piece is certainly an uncontainment of all that sort of built up stimulus and inspiration. By no means exclusively, but when I can, it's nice to use reclaimed or second-hand materials, and this stuff in particular came from many different shipping containers, and it's lovely to think that it will have travelled literally all over the world. So this piece has already had a sort of life before it turned into this. Corten, also called weathering steel, is one of my favourite materials to use as it sits in so well with the natural environment. Corten's got fantastic longevity, you know, with no paint. The elements do the painting, which gives it a lovely natural feel. And the way the water trickles down certain bits, you just couldn't imagine it, you know, nature does the rest. As with making all large work, having a maquette is always a very useful thing. Having got these panels back to the studio, I measured them up very accurately and then hand folded a 3.5 times scale model version of the panels, 34 small ones and 34 massive ones next to them. This allowed me to then make the maquette. I made each element one at a time, and the element following it would be slightly dictated by the one before, in that they need to sort of balance technically, but create a sense of sort of unbalance, but coherency at the same time, in that it doesn't all look like a sort of accident. With abstract sculpture, it's important, I think, to have a few constraints to work within, because otherwise you'd end up with a mess. I decided that going with no more than a 6-sided shape per element would be the maximum amount of detail that would be necessary to get in there, and that probably no more than 8 elements would be right. And I like the idea of these toppling, stacking sort of things that come together to create something kind of coherent, but also sort of, you know, slightly chaotic and slightly sort of unnerving. Yeah, like most people, like, probably wouldn't really want to stand where I'm standing. They almost wouldn't, you know. I like the idea of that anyway. Having made my my small-scale maquette, I had to dream up some way of scaling up, and I certainly didn't know how when I started. I just had a good idea that it'd be possible, and luckily it was. The first element I scaled up in a kind of point-to-point type system, just mathematically. It was an unbelievably long-winded process and completely stultifying and exhausting. But I knew that I just had to find an easier method or a quicker method, because it had taken literally a month. I experimented with an overhead projector, but it too was very long-winded, and I still thought there must be an easier way. Eventually, I came up with the process of wetting a piece of paper, smoothing it over each face on the model one at a time. I would then run round the edge of this face with a file, which would cut out the exact profile. Then, by marking the corrugation lines on it, removing it, drying it, and enlarging it on a photocopier, that would provide me with effectively a map or a template to lie over the big sheets of corrugation and then cut them out. Probably the trickiest thing, which has led to the most work, is the fact that these factory-made panels are incredibly inaccurate and escalate all over the place accuracy-wise. So my small-scale corrugations, they were absolutely accurate, and therefore scaling up should have been fairly sort of simple or slightly quicker than it was. But in reality, once I'd scaled up, there were huge voids everywhere, and the joins were absolutely horrendous and needed an enormous amount of filling and grinding and filling and grinding. Behind the scenes, or behind the totally polished or actually totally rusty exterior, there's a lot of structural work going on inside. Initially, I had the piece standing up in the workshop, and there was just a terrifying amount of wobble, so I knew that some reinforcement was essential. I came to the conclusion that I would need an enormous piece of stainless steel tube to run up the entire way up the inside. So this meant dismantling each element one by one and passing this enormous piece of stainless steel tube up the inside. Unfortunately, it's not a straight line up through there, so this meant cutting it and crooking it and shaping it sort of all the way up through. And this was a process of a couple of months. It was also necessary, for the sake of longevity, to fit an enormously thick piece of Corten on the base, and it actually continues up the sides of the base for about 4 inches and is blended in completely seamlessly with the thinner sheet above. That, I mean, like, it's just mad, isn't it? You can't see it at all, and that's about that was about 3 weeks work, yeah. After the piece was fully welded, it was necessary to get rid of all the weird colours that it was, so I took it for shot blasting. That's the only thing which was done sort of off-site and not by me. The shot blasting has the effect of removing all of the paint and keying up the metal so that it rusts fairly sort of uniformly and fairly quickly as well, which is essential. Corten as a material, it turns out, likes to get wet and dry out. It occurred to me that the interior of this sculpture is likely to be constantly damp, and therefore some protection against corrosion was necessary inside. The best way to protect the interior was with a sort of cavity wax that they use on cars. The best way to get that in, I felt, was to fill up each lump and slosh the thing around. I'm a great believer in the saying that necessity is the mother of invention. Certainly this tricky process required one hell of a good invention. I decided on this insane method of spinning the piece around in my workshop like a madman. That's sort of me, really. Something ridiculous like that is me all over. By using the spirit levels and a certain amount of the liquid, 35 litres, you could guarantee that each face had been covered. It was a great pleasure to be able to fully utilise my enormous studio and have this thing sort of scraping the ceiling. I like my big pieces not to have plinths where possible. I like the idea that they stand on the ground, or perhaps they emanate from the ground in the way that a tree does. Perhaps there's more going on underneath, going down to the Earth's core or something. This is a sort of eruption that's happened. My dad always says, classic How to Make Your Life as Difficult as Possible by Philip Ray Scott. I certainly won't get myself in this pickle again, but I have pulled it off.